Cuba. What the hell even goes on over there? Few people outside the country have any idea, but everyone still got really strong opinions about it. Most of the easily available information on the subject comes from people who are hell-bent on making the country sound as bad as possible. And as a reaction to those people, some others, well-intentioned as they may be, end up overcompensating and painting the country as some sort of utopia. So, I'm gonna try to give you an idea of what things are actually like for an average everyday person in Cuba, based on reliable academic research rather than anecdotes, speculation, or stories from someone's grandpa in Miami. Here goes. First, we need a very quick and incredibly oversimplified Cuban history lesson. Back in the 1950s, Cuba was ruled by Fulgencio Batista, a brutal US-backed dictator who continued a tradition of US domination of Cuban politics that dated back to the Spanish-American War of 1898. Until 1934, Cuba's constitution, which had been written under immense American pressure, even stipulated that the US had the right to invade the country for pretty much any reason that they wanted. So Havana was basically a giant casino that catered to American tourists, while the rest of Cuba was full of sugar plantations and American businesses that weren't exactly known for treating their workers very well. Unemployment was constantly at 25% or more, the poorest 20% of Cubans only received 2% of the national income, and the government was pretty happy to torture or murder anyone who lamented the situation. Batista predictably wasn't very popular, so in 1956, 84 guys, among them Fidel Castro and Che Guevara, landed a boat on the coast and tried to start a revolution. While only 20 of them survived the landing, rampant poverty and widespread hatred of the regime made it very easy for them to recruit. And so they eventually grew into an actual army and overthrew Batista in 1959. This new government then executed a bunch of Batista's soldiers and police for alleged crimes against humanity, a bedtime story told to children every night in Florida. They also proceeded to nationalize a lot of stuff, redistribute land, and so forth. Some Cubans reacted to this by leaving the country, and it also made the USA very mad, because this was the height of the Cold War, and well, that's communism. And so Cuba became the USA's new official boogeyman, which is kinda bad for them because the US is like 1,000 times bigger and only 90 miles away. Especially since, as an official State Department memo said, they pledged to deny money and supplies to Cuba, to decrease monetary and real wages, and to bring about hunger, desperation, and overthrow of the government. Bad news. So, to try and achieve those noble goals, the US tried to invade Cuba and failed. They put an embargo on it, which is still active today, you might have heard of it. They sponsored hundreds of terrorist attacks against it that no one ever talks about. And then there was that whole missile crisis thing where everyone thought the world was gonna end. It should have. Though the conflict continued after that, things calmed down a little bit. Or at least as calm as they possibly could be when a tiny island nation has been declared the eternal enemy of a world superpower that is literally right there. And so Cuba sought closer ties with the USSR and the Socialist Bloc, and they were able to implement a bunch of social programs like universal healthcare, free public education at all levels, and near guaranteed housing, among others. In the 70s and 80s, things in Cuba were pretty good. Hardly a utopia or anything, just relatively good compared to before, and people were generally optimistic. In fact, during this period, Cuba, despite being a tiny island nation, had the resources and the political will to allow it to project power as far away as in Africa, where it intervened militarily against apartheid South Africa in the Namibian War of Independence and the Angolan Civil War. Then, in the early 90s, things got bad. The USSR and most of the Socialist Bloc fell, and suddenly Cuba lost most of its international trade and support. This resulted in an economic crisis known as the Special Period, and the US embargo left Cuba with limited options to combat this. You see, it doesn't just affect trade from the US, it's actually enforced even against foreign companies that trade with both countries. For example, ships that trade with Cuba cannot dock in the USA for 6 months, and well, if they have to choose between them, they're gonna choose the much bigger market that's right next door. And worse, as Cuba was struggling, The USA made the embargo even harsher, but by the mid to late 90s, Cuba had nonetheless managed to recover after making some fairly drastic changes. The most important one was the restarting of the old tourist industry, which had been mostly neglected since the revolution due to the social issues that it caused beforehand. And thanks to a lot of government promotion and development, it got big again really fast, even despite restrictions on tourism from the USA, and by the mid-90s it was already Cuba's biggest source of foreign currency. This also brought with it the legalization of the US dollar, along with specific types of private yet highly regulated small businesses, many of them directed at tourists. This was very significant as beforehand almost everyone was directly employed by a state company. Since then, the tourist industry has only gotten even more important, and these private businesses, along with self-employment, have grown in popularity. Some big things have happened in the meantime, such as improved relations with the US under President Obama, which were subsequently totally destroyed by Trump, the death of Fidel Castro, rest in peace King, the passing of a new constitution, and the appointment of a president whose surname is not Castro. Yet despite further reforms under Raúl Castro, things have still not really changed that much since, despite a lot of speculation about how they were totally gonna at any moment now. Okay, so now we're finally at the present day after an incredible journey through history. It's time for the meat of the video. How stuff works materially for average Cubans. 72% of Cubans work for a company that's state-owned. This is actually quite a low percentage historically speaking. Back in 2007, for example, that number was 83%. Still, that's a big majority of the population. And according to the Cuban National Statistics Office, the average salary in Cuba's state sector is 687 pesos per month. Now, how much is that worth? Well, Cuba has a dual currency system. There's a second currency called the Cuban convertible peso, which is backed by official foreign currency reserves and pegged to the US dollar at a rate of 0.93 to 1. Normal pesos, that is the ones that state workers are paid in, exchange with the convertible peso at a rate of 25 to 1. If you're confused, don't worry. Everyone is. What's important is that all up, this means that the average Cuban salary is worth about $28 per month. Now, that's really low, isn't it? These people must all be homeless, starving, and living in squalor. Not quite. In Cuba, a lot of essential goods are sold at state-owned stores for heavily subsidized prices. For example, a pound of rice goes for about 3.5 pesos, which is about 14 US cents, and a pound of sweet potato goes for 1.5 pesos or 6 US cents. They also sell other everyday essentials like cleaning products, clothes, stationery, stuff like that, all priced to be affordable for people who earn an average salary. Now, relative to other countries, these still are not actually very good prices. For example, here in Argentina you can buy a pound of rice for about 0.3% of the monthly minimum wage. But in Cuba, those 3.5 pesos are about 0.5% of the monthly average wage. It is affordable, but it's not nearly as good as the price tag of 14 cents might make it look at first glance. This would be pretty bad, but there's more to it. Firstly, all Cuban individuals get a monthly allocation of food. This is called the ration book. Some people see this name and then assume that everything in Cuba is therefore rationed by the government, but it's more like a monthly allocation of specific amounts of goods at very cheap prices that you can also still buy from stores if you want or need more. For example, 2 pounds of ration book rice is 0.9 pesos. That's less than 2 cents per pound, or about 8 times cheaper than the price in subsidized markets. To quote a Cuban woman who's the head of her household, the rations only last 15 days at most. So it's hardly enough on its own, but combined with the government subsidized stores, it evens things out relative to other countries. The Cuban state also more directly provides free meals in many other cases. For example, workers at state companies receive a daily 15 peso lunch allowance, there's free school lunches, free meals in hospitals, free meals for the elderly, etc. All up, it's estimated that these programs account for a total of 41% of Cuba's calorie intake. And due to other public services, taxes, Cubans also have to budget for fewer costs than people in other countries, which frees up more of their salary. The most important of these are housing, healthcare, and education. Firstly, let's talk about housing, since for many of us, simply paying rent and bills takes up a huge portion of our monthly income. For example, in big US cities such as LA and New York, the median rent is more than 40% of average income. And just speaking from personal experience here, there's been times where I've spent more than 60% of my income on rent. So if we didn't have to pay for rent or mortgages, things would be a whole lot easier for many of us. Well, in Cuba, people don't have to. After the revolution, tenants were given ownership of their houses once they'd paid a certain amount of rent, whether the landlord was happy about it or not. And the state built additional housing that was rented out at 10% of the occupant's income. Then in the 80s, public housing tenants were also given ownership. Due to these programs, Cuba has a home ownership rate of 90%, top 10 in the world for context, and there's no mortgages, land, or property taxes to pay, so people just have to pay for utilities and maintenance. Houses must also actually be in use. If a homeowner dies or moves away permanently, their house is then passed on to others who live there. If there aren't any other residents who want it, then the government buys it at a fixed price, and then it's allocated to another family who'll put it to use. Swapping houses with other homeowners is legal, and since 2011, private sales are legal too, though the buyer has to be a Cuban citizen or permanent resident. Also, each family can only own 2 homes, one in which they live and one vacation home. Private rentals are also legal, though uncommon. Most rentals are of bedrooms in the family home rather than of entire houses, and the majority serve the tourist market. Utilities, unlike rent and mortgages, actually do hit the monthly budget. We can use electricity, the most expensive utility, as an example. Cuba's electricity consumption per person is 1,434 kilowatt hours per year, or 120 per month. Within this range, the cost per kilowatt hour is 1.2 cents. So the average Cuban spends $1.44 per month on electricity, that is to say about 5% of their salary. This is pretty average in global terms. If we extrapolate a little bit and say that they're also paying the same amount for water and gas, that's a total of 15% of their monthly salary on housing related costs. Considering the lack of additional costs like land taxes, rent, or mortgages, this is very low in global terms. In terms of housing quality, Cuba is well known for the rundown appearance of much of its housing, though this is generally just external. Inside, most houses function just fine. For some visual examples, here's some photos of some everyday Cuban kitchens, from an article by John C. Finn, an American cultural geographer. Most of them look about as good as any place that I've lived in, though some could definitely use a fresh coat of paint, and the 2 houses from the countryside are visibly more ramshackle than those from the city. But that's something that's also visible all over Latin America. That said, there's definitely inequalities in housing quality in Cuba. Some people can afford better renovations. Some people don't have easy access to running water. Some families only have 1 or 2 bedrooms. And there's still some informal housing like shantytowns. Cuba may approach housing differently to other nations and be quite successful in doing so, but that doesn't mean that it's perfect. But still, compared to the Latin American average, where 1 in 5 people live in slums, Cuba does pretty well on housing, and all without stuffing too many people into one dwelling. The average number of people per household in Cuba is 2.88, which is similar to Ireland at 2.85, and much lower than Chile at 3.7. Next, there's the famous Cuban healthcare system, which boasts some of the best outcomes in Latin America. The right to free healthcare has been constitutionally enshrined in Cuba since 1976, and this is provided through an expansive public healthcare system that also offers free dental care. As Cuba lacks access to the equipment and medicine required to treat some advanced illnesses, partly due to the US embargo, this system is focused on preventative care. While in some other countries, people have to agonize over the cost of even a simple checkup. In Cuba, they are not only free, but frequent checkups are very much encouraged. This means that many issues are detected and treated before requiring advanced care. Of course, sometimes such advanced care is still required, and in these cases, Cuba can struggle to provide it locally. Still, it gets good results, even apart from just its high life expectancy. For example, adjusted for age, per 100,000 people, 122 Cubans die of cancer per year, which compares favorably with the 149 per 100,000 of the USA. And again, it's all totally completely free. Literally zero costs, something that few other countries can boast and which saves the average Cuban a whole lot of money. Then there's the education system, which is also completely free at all levels from kindergarten to PhDs. It's also a very high quality for the region. In UNESCO's Education for All rankings, it's 32nd in the world and first in Latin America, and the World Bank, in its assessment of Latin American education systems, said that no Latin American school system today, except possibly Cuba's, is very close to high standards. And also, contrary to some weirdly common beliefs, Cubans can indeed choose their own career path, which includes what they want to study, where they want to work, you know, just like you. And there's also some other stuff that they get more value from, such as free/heavily subsidized public transportation. All in all, it's clear that this $28 average salary goes a lot further than what you might expect. Comparing purchasing power between Cuba and other countries is very difficult because its economy is so distinct, but I think it's safe to say that the average Cuban has it at least as well as the average person in Latin America. Where it does differ is in those social guarantees. While they don't reach everyone equally and while they're hardly perfect, they're still there and they're enough to ensure that the vast majority of Cubans don't have their basic human needs unfulfilled. Needs that in most other countries will be left unfulfilled if you can't pay. And in Latin America especially, many people can't. That Cuba is able to provide these basic guarantees despite its relatively low levels of gross wealth shows that most other countries can do so too. The point of an economy is, after all, to serve human needs, not to just make numbers go up for the sake of it. The rest of us could definitely learn something from Cuba. But wait, we're not done yet. There's more complexities, caveats, and myths to cover. Remember what I said earlier about the second currency that's pegged to the dollar? And also the fact that 28% of Cubans aren't employed by the state? Yeah, so the state salaries that most people earn aren't the end of it. I just first wanted to show what things are like for people who do only live off that income. Many of those state workers supplement their incomes in other ways, legitimate or otherwise, and that often involves convertible pesos or dollars, which from here on out will simply be referred to as dollars because they're basically the same thing. Perhaps they raise chickens in their backyard and sell eggs to their neighbors. Perhaps they moonlight as taxi drivers. Perhaps they go and play guitar for tourists on the weekends. Whatever it is, many Cubans have such extra sources of income. And these income sources are very important because many products don't have subsidized prices and are instead sold at international market rates. Nothing that's particularly essential per se. These products include things like running shoes, TVs, electric kettles, smartphones, etc. These are sold in government-run stores that are essentially designed to get people to spend their dollars so that the government can remove them from the economy and get them into their budget. They're literally called foreign currency recovery stores. Dollar incomes also give people better access to the more expensive private markets, where they can find more luxuries and also a wider selection of basic goods, such as specific ingredients that there might be shortages of in state stores. This doesn't mean that people in Cuba are starving, rather that at times someone might want to have, say, chicken for lunch, but find that there's not any left at the state markets. As anthropologist Hannah Garth wrote, Cubans face a form of non-extreme food scarcity where certain ingredients are nearly impossible to acquire and others are difficult to find, but something is almost always available to prevent hunger. So there's always something to eat, It just might not be what the consumer specifically wants in that moment. This might sound like sacrilege to those of us who are used to supermarkets that are like full of everything, but keep in mind that most people in the world can't readily choose what they eat either. What's normal for us isn't close to normal for the majority. Private vendors tend to always have stock, which makes it easier to find specific goods, if of course the buyer can afford them. Though this isn't so much because they actually have more stock than the state stores, rather just that less people are buying from them. Of those 28% of Cubans who don't work for a state company, 5% work in cooperatives. Most of these are agricultural co-ops, while a small portion are former state companies that were sold to their workers. These cooperatives typically don't earn in dollars, and in some cases they even turn out to be unprofitable, so they might actually make less money than state workers do. Cooperative workers, therefore, are not necessarily better off than average. Of the other 23%, a majority are private farmers. These farmers generally sell their produce both to state companies and private sellers, and since they also sell privately, they're involved in the dollar economy, and thus they're generally going to make quite a bit more than state employees. The others, about 500,000 people, are cuentapropistas, or self-employed people. These range from small family business owners of anything from like a corner store to a restaurant, to taxi drivers, to street vendors of all sorts, etc, etc. While they're highly taxed, these workers can still make more in a day than a government worker makes in a month, especially if they get tips from tourists. This is the source of the oft-repeated adage that a taxi driver in Cuba makes more money than a doctor. It's not that their salary is higher, it's that a taxi driver is obviously a lot more likely to deal with tourists and thus get tips from them than a doctor is. Even some workers at state companies can earn tips from tourists. Much of the tourist industry in Cuba is run by the state, for example, so everyone from bellhops to waiters to tour guides could actually be a government employee, paid the same sort of salary as everyone else, but with access to tips. Another big source of income for many Cubans is remittances from family working abroad. Exact figures are hard to determine, but surveys indicate that upwards of 60% of Cubans receive remittances. And yes, Cubans can actually leave Cuba freely. The requirement for an exit permit was removed back in 2013, so regular tourism and migration is now much more accessible. The biggest barriers to immigration these days are two things. Most importantly, that it's exceedingly difficult for Cubans to get visas through regular means. In fact, few countries will even grant them tourist visas, let alone work visas. And second, it's very difficult to save the money for things like plane tickets, visa application costs, and a rental deposit in another country, since most Cubans are paid a salary that doesn't convert very well internationally, to say the least. Still though, with the growth in the dollar economy, it's becoming more and more common to see Cuban migrants abroad, aside from those who are able to get refugee status. There's also temporary migrants such as the famous Cuban doctors who earn hundreds of dollars a month, which by now I'm sure you understand is quite a fortune in Cuba. If you want to learn more about them, I made a longer video on the subject on my second channel, which you can watch by clicking here, or maybe it's here. I forget which side it is, I'm sorry. So yeah, the many different types of Cubans abroad often send money back home, and this is another way through which people gain access to dollarized markets. So there's many ways through which Cubans might have more income than just what the average state worker earns. And as you might be thinking, this causes some pretty big inequalities, something which has progressively been getting much worse since the 90s. It's not so much that quality of life has degraded for normal Cuban wage earners, it's rather that the living standards of those with access to the relatively new dollar economy have skyrocketed in comparison, and those without access to it are being left behind. And this obviously greatly contradicts Cuba's ethos of equality. All of this is a consequence of the promotion of the tourist industry to solve Cuba's economic woes in the wake of the fall of the USSR, combined with the formalizing of the dollar economy. That's more of an observation than a criticism though. Thanks largely to Mr. US embargo, Cuba didn't really have many other options to recover economically at the time, and its Caribbean location, its cultural capital, and the allure of its unique society all make tourism an obvious solution. The government knew that it would bring with it some of the social ills that plagued the island in the pre-revolutionary days, and they knew that they wouldn't be able to control the inevitable flow of foreign currency, which is why they just legalized it. All of this was considered something of a temporary necessary evil rather than a desirable permanent solution. And yet here we are a couple of decades later, and not much has changed. The government pledged to unify the two currencies way back in 2013, which would go a long way to fixing the inequalities that the dual currency system has caused, but it still hasn't happened and the tourist industry is still predominant. During Raúl Castro's rule from 2006 to 2018, he implemented a lot of measures to move the state out of certain industries, especially service industries such as restaurants. The idea was that the new small business sector would take their place, and that since they make so much money by local standards, they could therefore be taxed to help fund government programs and everyone would win out in the end. But in practice, while Cuba still has its quality-free public services, the government has started to dial back its subsidies on goods and on direct provisions such as the ration book. So the people who aren't involved in small business or the dollar economy just aren't seeing any benefits from these policy shifts, and in some cases are even losing out. One more issue that I wanted to mention is the difficulty and cost of accessing the internet. Though this is partly caused by the USA refusing to allow an undersea cable from Florida to Cuba, ironically while also being the first to criticize Cuba for its lack of internet access. Contrary to popular belief, the internet in Cuba is actually open these days. Occasionally the government might censor a website, but it's pretty uncommon. And Cubans freely use all the same social media sites as everyone else. Most of the sites that are inaccessible from Cuba are actually international websites that deny access there in order to comply with the US embargo. And just one more note on the embargo. While it is a big deal, it's more of one for US-Cuba relations and for some specific industries than it is in macroeconomic terms. It's been around for so long that it's practically a part of the furniture, so the Cuban government knows how to account for it and how to work around it. Its worst effect isn't so much in stunting raw economic growth as it is in limiting Cuba's access to essential goods, particularly medical supplies and especially considering US dominance of the global pharmaceuticals industry. This is despite the fact that such supplies are at least ostensibly exempt from the embargo. Professor of International Law Nigel White wrote on the topic, although the licensing and sales of medicines and medical supplies was clearly permitted for the first time in 1992, thereby creating a humanitarian exemption on paper, the system of license application has deterred US companies from applying, given the rejection of numerous applications on the grounds that proposed exports would be detrimental to US foreign policy interests. Ships are also prevented from loading or unloading in US ports for 180 days after delivering cargo to Cuba. This has led to a severe reduction in the delivery of medical equipment to Cuba. The medical exemption to the embargo was effectively undermined by the very act that introduced it. Let's conclude. Okay, so things are hardly bad for the average Cuban, especially by regional standards, but they haven't really been getting much better either. Meanwhile, they've had to watch some of their compatriots suddenly start earning relatively ridiculous amounts of money. The intent of this video is to describe and diagnose rather than to propose solutions. It's not like the government of Cuba is going to listen to some YouTube guy anyway. But it is pretty clear that Cuba needs to do certain things, a lot of which they've already signaled their intention to do. Like it needs to unify the two currencies sooner rather than later, to curb these inequalities and to give more Cubans access to these goods that are currently only available on the dollar market. Though this would clearly have profound additional effects on the economy that remain to be seen. It also needs to do something to curb its reliance on tourism. This will take a long time to change, of course, but some sort of long-term plan is needed, unless things are just to stay the same forever. With the massive incomes of small businesses, one survey of 117 so-called entrepreneurs found that self-employed people have incomes that start at $600 a month, that is to say 20 times more than the average salary of a state worker, the government should probably start excluding some of these high earners from welfare programs and subsidies, as it doesn't really make sense for them to have the same access to these things. This would allow more of those resources to go to the people that actually need them. Aside from that, it wouldn't really be fair to do more than simply tax those high earners, as very few of them even have a single employee outside of their own family, so they can't really be said to be exploiting anyone. Aside from perhaps tourists, that is, but who cares about them? Milk 'em for all they're worth. That's all just what I think anyway. So, in summary, being a Cuban in Cuba generally isn't incredible, nor is it terrible. Cuba isn't one gigantic slum, nor is it a utopia. Like any country, it has its problems, many of which have been caused by what some might call economic liberalization. Though due to its very different socio-economic organization, these are different problems than those that are usually seen in other countries. Those same differences make Cuba a subject of curiosity, spite, and romanticism all at once. In fact, chances are that you're watching this video in the first place for one of those three reasons. The reality of it is quite interesting, but still not as exciting as the endless back and forth slap fights on Cuba might lead you to expect. Cubans, just like you or I, are just people who are living their lives as best as they can, with what they're given and what they can get. And while what they're given is pretty damn good compared to basically every other country in the world, what they can get could definitely stand to be improved. Or like, just give them more. Whichever. Regardless of how much Juan Miami Fidel took my farm insists that all Cubans live in unimaginable poverty and want the US to give them democracy as soon as possible, the real situation is a lot more complicated. Shocker. Thanks for watching. If you like this video, why not subscribe? And if you really liked it, consider supporting me on Patreon, becoming a member on YouTube, or sending me a one-time donation on Ko-fi. Now I'd like to thank all of my patrons, and especially my $25 plus patrons: Fer Tajon, Jesse Hosick, Super Pancake Man, Tonga Purutu Neha, and now my $10 plus patrons: Industrial Robot, Jilly Bean, Mitsuki Kazin, Christoph Kaczynski, Crouton and Baguette, Audrey and Nate Fawn, Diego Asalvati, Nico Del Sesto, Morimer, Young Trotsky, Mubashir Razvi, Violet Rain, One Trash Boy, Cincioni Brezgal, Mamushin, and Igor Dozak. Thank you. Bye.